ever look around and just feel like the traditional roles of masculinity and spirituality are, completely under siege in modern society?
Yeah, it's a very common feeling right now.
Right, like the very foundations of what it means to be a man, the biological imperatives, the historical roles, the spiritual mandates, like they are actively, intentionally being dismantled.
Absolutely.
If you have, you are definitely not alone. Welcome to this deep dive. But before we get into the weeds today, do me a huge favor and hit the like and subscribe buttons right now.
Yeah, definitely hit those buttons.
Seriously, tap them right now because today's deep dive is an incredibly comprehensive review of a compelling new ebook that addresses exactly that feeling of cultural dislocation.
It really hits the nail on the head.
It does. And if you find today's topic as fascinating as it promises to be, you should head over to Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book.
Highly recommend picking it up.
And make sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Right, at Conrad Riker.
So let's get into it. What are we looking at today?
So the source material we are unpacking today is Conrad Riker's 2024 ebook. It's titled Spiritual Warfare, Masculine Enlightenment in a Broken World.
Great title.
Yeah, very striking. And the mission of this deep dive is to thoroughly unpack this text.
Right.
The author frames this not just as, a casual self-help book. It's pitched as a literal battle plan written specifically for red-pilled, rational men in the manosphere.
A battle plan. I like that.
Exactly.
Love it.
Our goal today is to explore the arguments laid out in the text regarding the history of our institutions, the claims of their capture by feminists and Marxists, and most importantly, the step-by-step psychological and spiritual roadmap provided for men.
To kind of reclaim their strength in a world that often feels really hostile to it.
Precisely.
Now, before we launch into the deep end, we have a mandatory impartiality disclaimer.
Always important.
Yeah, we want to speak directly to you, the listener, and state very clearly that this book contains highly politically charged content.
Very charged.
Regarding left-wing and right-wing ideologies, feminism, and Marxism, we want to emphasize, in the strongest possible terms, that we are never taking sides or endorsing the viewpoints of this content.
Right, we are totally neutral here.
Our purpose here today is strictly to impartially report on the ideas presented in the text. We are analyzing the concepts contained in the original source material to help you understand this specific worldview.
We are your guides to the text.
Nothing more, nothing less.
Exactly. Our role is synthesis and analysis of the provided material, exploring how the author constructs these arguments and the specific historical and psychological frameworks used to support them.
And the frameworks used here are, they are absolute heavy hitters.
Oh yeah, big time.
I am leading with pure enthusiasm today because the sheer depth of the psychology utilized to build this battle plan is incredible.
It's very dense.
It weaves together Abraham Maslow, Erik Erikson, and Carl Jung.
To create a roadmap for surviving a cultural wasteland.
Okay, so let's unpack this. How does a book about modern political and cultural grievances tie into the foundational theories of human psychology?
Well, to understand that, we have to start where the text starts.
Which is the historical context of the institutional capture being described.
Right. Because you can't fight a spiritual war if you don't know the terrain.
Exactly. So let's set the stage. What does the landscape actually look like according to this worldview?
The absolute foundation of the worldview presented in this book is the concept of the red pill.
The red pill. Okay.
To understand the psychological roadmap, we first have to understand the specific reality the modern man is supposedly navigating.
Right.
What's fascinating here is how the text defines this red-pilled awakening. It draws, of course, from the 1999 film The Matrix,
Classic movie.
where the protagonist is offered a choice between a comforting illusion, the blue pill, and the harsh, unvarnished truth of reality.
The red pill.
Right. The text defines being red-pilled as a sudden, jarring awareness of the harsh realities of the world.
Like waking up.
Yes. It is the psychological breakdown of the delusions that are actively created and maintained by society, academia, and mainstream media.
It's that visceral moment of realizing the simulation doesn't match the code.
Exactly.
The premise here is that being red-pilled means realizing that the media's portrayal of reality simply does not correspond to the actual ground-level state of affairs.
Right, and the text characterizes the red-pilled crowd not as fringe conspiracy theorists.
Which is how they're often portrayed.
Exactly. But rather as intellectuals, critical thinkers, and free spirits who fundamentally refuse to just regurgitate mainstream narratives.
They are the guys who look at the screen, see the glitches, and start asking uncomfortable questions.
And the book provides very specific illustrative examples of what this red-pilled perspective looks like in practice.
Especially when looking at recent history.
Yes. For instance, the text spends time deconstructing the 2008 financial crisis.
Oh, that's a big one.
Huge. Now, the mainstream narrative, what the author would call the blue pill narrative, is that the crash was a systemic failure of risky subprime mortgage lending.
A tragic oversight by regulators.
Right. But the red-pilled view presented here sees it entirely differently.
How so?
It frames the 2008 crisis as a deliberate move by global elites and central bankers to crash the economy in order to consolidate wealth and power.
Wow. Which, I mean, makes perfect sense when you look at the psychological fallout of that event for the average man.
It was devastating.
The text points out that countless everyday people, men who played by the rules, worked hard, and provided for their families, completely lost their homes and their financial security.
While the instigators,
The massive financial institutions that created the toxic assets.
they were bailed out with taxpayer money.
And emerged even more affluent.
Exactly. When a man witnesses that level of institutional hypocrisy, something inside him breaks.
The social contract is voided, you realize the game is rigged, and that realization is the essence of taking the red pill.
Precisely. And this raises the question.
What does this profound disillusionment mean for the individual man?
Right. According to the text, these revelations force men to confront incredibly inconvenient truths.
Which inevitably influences their personal and spiritual exploration.
Once you realize you've been manipulated by the very institutions meant to protect you, you stop trusting the approved curriculum.
You start seeking out authentic teachings.
The author mentions Jordan Peterson's early maps of meaning lectures as a prime example of a starting point for a lot of these men.
Because Peterson wasn't offering platitudes, he was offering a rigorous archetypal structure for understanding suffering and responsibility.
Exactly. The text argues that this hunger for structure encourages men to look far beyond mainstream psychology.
Which often feels overly sanitized these days.
It does, and it forces them to chisel out their own path. They are looking for intellectual heavyweights who treat life as the serious, dangerous endeavor it actually is.
If we connect this search for truth to the bigger picture, this deep skepticism of mainstream narratives leads directly into the unmasking of what the text identifies as the primary enemy of the modern man.
Cultural Marxism.
Right. To understand the history of our institutions before they were allegedly captured, the author traces the roots of cultural Marxism back to the early 20th century,
Specifically to the Institute of Social Research.
better known as the Frankfurt School.
Yes, the text mentions scholars like Max Horkheimer and Theodore W. Adorno.
And here's where the historical analysis gets really interesting. The traditional Marxism of the 19th and early 20th centuries was primarily an economic theory.
It was focused on a proletariat revolution.
The working class rising up to seize the means of production from the bourgeoisie.
But when that economic revolution largely failed to materialize in the prosperous post-war West, these radical left-wing intellectuals realized they needed to change their approach.
The text explains that the strategy shifted.
Instead of targeting traditional economic systems, they began targeting cultural values and social norms in order to destabilize and eventually overthrow Western democracy from the inside out.
The methodology shifted from economic class warfare to cultural identity warfare.
The author relies on modern conservative scholars, referencing works like David Horowitz's The Black Book of the American Left.
To argue that this is a patient revolutionary ideology that has methodically permeated every social and cultural facet of the West.
The core argument of the book is that these ideologies are not just political disagreements.
That actively target the core of man.
They seek to dismantle his identity, his inherent purpose, and his connection with the divine.
By systematically destroying the traditional societal structures that historically supported him.
And the primary mechanism for this destruction is institutional capture.
So let's talk about that institutional capture, because the text doesn't just speak in vague historical terms.
No, it lays out highly specific examples.
Exactly, of how it believes this ideological takeover has occurred. First up is the education system.
University.
The argument here is that over the last few decades, universities have completely transformed. They used to be bastions of free thought, rigorous debate, and the pursuit of objective truth.
Now, the text claims they function as indoctrination centers.
It specifically points to the rise of women's and gender studies programs.
Right. The author claims these specific academic disciplines have effectively replaced traditional critical thinking with a rigid dogma.
A dogma that fundamentally teaches that male-dominated societies, or the patriarchy, are the root cause of all historical and modern evils.
The implication is that young men entering these institutions are immediately put on the defensive.
They are taught that their inherent biological and psychological traits are inherently oppressive.
And if they survive the university system, they step out into a culture heavily influenced by the mainstream media.
Which is the next captured institution the book targets.
The text argues that the media pushes narratives deliberately designed to obscure a balanced view of reality.
Just look at the classic sitcom trope that has dominated television for 30 years.
The bumbling dad.
Exactly. The media purposely portrays men, specifically fathers, as bumbling, incompetent idiots who can barely tie their own shoes.
While the women are portrayed as infallible, hyper-competent heroes who always have to swoop in and save the day.
It is a subtle but persistent psychological conditioning.
Furthermore, the text highlights the modern media's heavy push for gender fluidity.
Right. The author's argument here is strategic. If the cultural consensus dictates that gender can be entirely fluid, then the rigid, historically grounded roles assigned to men and women become entirely obsolete.
And if those complementary roles are obsolete, the traditional nuclear family unit, which relies on those structures, is fundamentally threatened and destabilized.
The text even brings the legal system into the crosshairs.
Claiming it has been skewed by these same ideologies to treat men as default perpetrators.
The argument is that in certain contexts, particularly family court or Title IX campus tribunals, the foundational Western legal principle of innocent until proven guilty has been effectively inverted for men.
And to tie this all together, the author uses Shelby Steele's book, White Guilt,
to argue that this entire overarching ideological framework fosters a pervasive culture of victimhood and moral relativism.
That is a crucial point in the book's thesis. The argument is that instead of focusing on personal agency, resilience, and spiritual growth, the population is encouraged to get caught up in endless cycles of resentment, grievance, and entitlement.
The ultimate design of this cultural shift, the author claims, is to purposely emasculate men,
rendering them docile, compliant, and incapable of resisting the broader ideological takeover.
But the author also points out that men aren't just taking this lying down.
Right, there is resistance.
To illustrate a successful grassroots pushback against this institutional infiltration, the text references the Gamergate controversy from the 2010s.
Now, regardless of how the mainstream media covered that event, the book views it through a very specific lens.
It sees Gamergate as a prime example of a traditionally male-dominated sphere.
The hardcore gaming community.
Drawing a line in the sand and rising up against the tide of Marxist infiltration and the forced inclusion of radical feminism in video game journalism and development.
The text holds Gamergate up as a stark historical reminder of the power of collective resistance.
It proved that when a group of predominantly red-pilled men decide they are not going to accept the policing of their hobbies and their spaces, they can actually generate enough friction to push back the ideological vanguard.
It was a digital prototype for the broader cultural pushback the author is calling for.
But here's where the book takes a massive pivot.
Yeah, this is a big shift.
It doesn't just view this conflict as a standard political or cultural battle over tax rates or zoning laws.
It takes us a massive step further into the literal spiritual realm.
The author asserts that cultural Marxism, at its very core, is inherently rooted in satanic principles.
The text references William S. Lynn's work on the subject.
To argue that these supposedly progressive ideals would prioritize deconstruction, moral relativism, and the inversion of natural order actually go against the very basis of true spirituality.
True spirituality, the author argues, always seeks to uphold objective goodness, absolute truth, and righteousness.
What's truly fascinating is how the author identifies the subtle ways this spiritual inversion manifests in everyday pop culture.
Like the critique of the hit Netflix series Lucifer.
Yes. The book points out the absolute absurdity of how the show is framed. It blatantly humanizes the devil.
It presents the ultimate figure of cosmic evil, not as a vile, deceptive creature,
but as a misunderstood, charming, relatable anti-hero who runs a nightclub and helps solve crimes.
The author argues that this isn't just harmless entertainment.
It is a calculated cultural mechanism that subliminally normalizes moral decay.
By making the devil the good guy, you blur the lines between ultimate good and ultimate evil, steering the public away from traditional, objective truth.
So this paints a very bleak picture of the modern landscape.
It really does.
If the world is fundamentally broken, if the institutions from academia to the media to the courts are captured by Marxists and feminists,
and if pop culture is actively pushing satanic ideologies that invert morality,
how does a man survive? More importantly, how does a man rebuild his internal foundation to fight back and achieve masculine enlightenment?
That is the million-dollar question.
And it brings us right into section 2 of our deep dive, the psychological roadmap to spiritual masculinity.
The author argues you can't fight a spiritual war if your mind is a mess.
You need a psychological battle plan.
And the book starts building this plan with an absolute cornerstone of behavioral science.
Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Right. Maslow's 1943 theory of human motivation is something most people encounter in Psych 101.
But the text applies it in a very specific, tactical way.
The hierarchy categorizes human needs from the most basic to the most complex.
At the very bottom are physiological needs.
The absolute biological requirements for human survival, like food, water, and shelter.
The next level up involves safety needs.
Physical security, health, and financial stability.
Once those are met, you move up to social needs, which involve love, belonging, and tribe.
Above that are esteem needs, the desire for self-respect, mastery, and the respect of your peers.
And finally, at the absolute pinnacle is self-actualization.
The ultimate expression of your unique human potential and purpose.
We all know the basic pyramid, but what's fascinating is how the book weaponizes that bottom tier for the modern red-pilled man.
The author says Maslow's model is highly rational and logical, which naturally resonates with a masculine understanding of the world.
Men want a system they can build from the ground up.
So the book looks at those foundational physiological and safety needs and uses them to rationally justify the modern survivalist or prepper mindset.
The logic here is incredibly pragmatic.
The argument is that it is quite literally impossible to focus on achieving Zen spiritual actualization or deep theological understanding when you are panicked about the price of groceries.
Or when you aren't sure you can physically protect your home.
If your baseline is compromised, your spiritual bandwidth is zero.
You cannot engage in spiritual warfare if you are physically starving or vulnerable.
It's the old adage. You have to secure your own oxygen mask before helping others.
The book makes the case that true masculine enlightenment requires a foundation of absolute, unshakable physical reality.
And this raises an important point.
Right. How does one actually build that foundation and progress through these stages in a world that is actively trying to keep you dependent and distracted?
To illustrate this progression, the author points to a phenomenal modern example.
Navy SEAL Jocko Willink.
Yes. The text cites Willink as the prime illustrative example of someone who mastered this hierarchy.
Willink conquered immense physical, emotional, and intellectual challenges in one of the most punishing and demanding arenas imaginable.
Special operations combat.
By securing his physiological and safety needs through extreme, unrelenting daily discipline.
The famous 4:30 a.m. wake-ups.
The grueling physical training.
Willink built an unbreakable foundation.
Discipline equals freedom. That's his motto, and it perfectly aligns with the book's use of Maslow.
Because Willink mastered the bottom of the pyramid through sheer force of will, he earned the freedom to reach the top.
He achieved self-actualization, finding a deep, profound sense of leadership and purpose that now inspires millions of other men to take control of their own lives.
He is the blueprint for turning physical discipline into spiritual authority.
But the author doesn't stop at Maslow.
No, Maslow is presented merely as the structural foundation.
To share the actual path of human development over time, the text layers on Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages.
Erikson's model is brilliant because it views life as a series of specific conflicts.
He breaks the human lifespan down into 8 distinct stages, from infancy to late adulthood.
And posits that each stage has a specific crisis that a person must successfully resolve to develop a healthy psyche.
Rather than listing out all 8 stages like a textbook, let's look at how the book actually applies this theory to the manosphere.
The core argument here is that the modern male depression, the soaring suicide rates, the intense alienation we see today.
These aren't just random chemical imbalances.
No, they are the direct result of men failing to resolve specific developmental crises.
Because the culture no longer provides the necessary rites of passage to help them do so.
Exactly. Take, for example, the stage Erikson calls intimacy versus isolation.
Which typically occurs in young adulthood.
In a healthy society, a young man learns to form deep, meaningful, committed relationships, both romantic and platonic.
But in a captured, atomized culture that promotes endless casual hookups, distrust between the sexes, and social media isolation.
Many men fail to resolve this crisis.
The result? They fall into profound isolation, deep loneliness, and a complete disconnect from any spiritual community.
But the flip side is also true.
Right. The text argues that successfully navigating and resolving these crises builds highly specific weaponized virtues that are essential for spiritual warfare.
If a man can resolve the very first stage of infancy trust versus mistrust, he builds the virtue of deep, unshakable hope.
If he can navigate the final stage of life integrity versus despair, he builds the virtue of profound wisdom.
To ground this psychological theory in reality, the author provides some incredibly vivid, illustrative examples.
The most striking is the story of George Washington Carver, the legendary agrarian scientist.
Carver's life is a masterclass in resolving psychological crises against impossible odds.
He was born into slavery, orphaned, and faced immense systemic adversity during his early childhood.
According to Erickson's model, that level of trauma should have led to profound, lifelong mistrust and psychological crippling.
But it didn't.
The text details how Carver, despite his frail health and brutal circumstances, spent his time wandering the woods.
Developing an intense, intimate connection with the natural world and the Creator.
He took the absolute worst conditions for the trust versus mistrust stage and somehow used them to build a deep, unshakable spiritual trust in the universe.
He proves that early-stage struggles and childhood trauma don't have to be permanent handicaps.
For the red-pilled man reading this, the message is clear.
Your past trauma is actually the raw material, the catalyst for your own spiritual odyssey.
The author also introduces a highly relatable modern example to show how this works in the present day.
The story of a guy named Jake.
Jake is described as a relatively successful modern entrepreneur.
But internally, he was paralyzed by a lingering, debilitating sense of inferiority.
He was stuck in Erickson's industry versus inferiority stage.
Constantly comparing himself to the curated highlight reels of other men on social media, feeling like an imposter in his own life.
And how did he fix it?
The book details how Jake used Erickson's framework as a literal diagnostic tool.
He realized he hadn't resolved that specific childhood crisis of competence.
So he stopped trying to be Elon Musk overnight. He set highly realistic, incremental goals.
He celebrated small, daily wins.
He consciously chose to take on projects that align with his specific natural strengths, rather than trying to force himself into a mold that didn't fit.
By consciously using this psychological map to resolve his lingering inferiority crisis, Jake completely changed his self-perception.
Obliterated his imposter syndrome and skyrocketed his business trajectory.
What Jake achieved is the perfect segue into the next crucial element of the book's roadmap.
The connection between psychology and ultimate meaning.
The text highlights the work of Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor who authored the seminal book, Man's Search for Meaning.
Frankl's psychological theories weren't forged in a comfortable university office.
They were forged in the unimaginable horrors of a Nazi concentration camp.
Frankl observed firsthand that the men who survived the camps weren't necessarily the most physically robust.
The men who survived were the ones who had a deep, burning wire purpose that transcended their current suffering.
Whether it was the hope of reuniting with a loved one or an unfinished manuscript they had to write.
That purpose was their ultimate spiritual anchor.
The author takes Frankl's profound lesson from the mid-20th century and applies it directly to men trying to survive today.
The argument is that while the modern man isn't in a literal gulag, he is navigating what the author calls a modern cultural wasteland.
A society designed to strip him of his identity and replace it with cheap digital dopamine.
In this environment, discovering and clinging to one's unique purpose is not just a nice self-help concept.
It is an absolute necessity for spiritual survival.
A strong, unyielding sense of identity and purpose acts as a psychological shield against the demoralizing narratives of cultural Marxism we discussed earlier.
If you know exactly who you are and what you were put on this earth to do, the media's attempt to paint you as a toxic problem simply bounces off you.
But here is the rub.
Figuring out who you genuinely are requires terrifyingly deep introspection.
You have to look at the ugly parts of yourself.
Which leads us perfectly into section 3 of our deep dive. Carl Jung, The Shadow, and Individuation.
Carl Jung is an absolute heavy hitter in the world of depth psychology.
And his theories are central to this book's battle plan.
Let's start with the overarching goal. The individuation process.
Individuation, as coined by Jung, is the lifelong, arduous journey of moving from an initial state of unconsciousness,
which is basically a blind, unthinking identification with the collective crowd and societal expectations,
to a state of complete, independent psychological wholeness.
The book frames this process not just as therapy, but as the ultimate rite of passage for men.
Because our modern society has largely abandoned formal rites of passage.
We don't send young men into the wilderness to face danger anymore.
Right, so men have to undergo this process internally.
Individuation requires ripping off the masks.
It requires systematically stripping away the layers of societal conditioning, the polite behaviors we adopt just to fit into corporate culture or appease modern sensibilities.
In order to unearth true, authentic masculine power.
And this process is notoriously difficult because the biggest obstacle to individuation is what Jung famously called the shadow.
The author focuses heavily on this concept.
The shadow is defined as the dark, repressed, unconscious aspect of our personality.
It acts as a psychological basement where we lock away all the traits, desires, and instincts that polite society or our own internalized guilt deems unacceptable or dangerous.
And here is where the text brilliantly connects 20th century psychoanalysis to the reality of the modern manosphere.
The core argument the book makes is that modern culture, driven entirely by the feminist and Marxist ideologies we mapped out earlier, actively and aggressively labels natural biological masculine instincts as toxic.
Things like natural aggression, territoriality, the desire to conquer.
Stoicism, the urge to compete and dominate.
These have been the driving forces of human progress for millennia.
But today, a young boy displaying these traits is often medicated, disciplined, or told he is problematic.
Because society roundly condemns these inherent traits, men are systematically forced to suppress them.
They're forced to push their very inherent masculinity down into the dark basement of the shadow.
They become nice guys, completely disconnected from their own primal energy.
But the author argues for a powerful paradox.
True masculine enlightenment, the kind required to be a spiritual warrior, actually requires embracing this darkness rather than rejecting it.
It's the old Jordan Peterson idea that a good man isn't a harmless man.
A good man is a very dangerous man who has that danger under voluntary control.
The text asserts that by doing the grueling shadow work and integrating these dark, aggressive parts of the psyche, a man becomes whole.
He stops seeking external validation from a society that hates him anyway.
He becomes completely immune to the emasculating demands of the culture because he has accepted his whole self, teeth and claws included.
To drive this profound point home, the text utilizes a brilliant contrast of historical and mythological figures.
To show the consequences of ignoring the shadow.
First, it looks at the mythology of King Arthur and his illegitimate son, Mordred.
In the lore, Arthur represents the conscious, shining, noble ideal of the king.
But he completely refuses to acknowledge Mordred, who represents his dark mirror, his sins, his literal shadow self.
Because Arthur denies the shadow, it ferments, grows powerful, and ultimately casts a tragic, apocalyptic shadow over his entire reign.
Destroying Camelot. The lesson is clear. Denying the dark parts of your nature leads inevitably to ruin.
The book also brings in a massive historical example.
Alexander the Great.
Here is a man who conquered the entire known world before his 30th birthday.
The ultimate masculine archetype of the conqueror.
But the text points out that Alexander ultimately succumbed to excessive alcohol consumption, paranoia, and died young.
Why? The author attributes this tragic end to Alexander's completely unacknowledged shadow of uncontrolled, ravenous ambition.
He conquered the external world, but refused to conquer his internal darkness.
And that unintegrated shadow ultimately consumed and destroyed him.
To bridge the gap between ancient conquerors and the modern reader, the author introduces another contemporary case study.
A man named John.
John is described as a highly successful modern entrepreneur who, on the surface, projects an aura of absolute alpha masculine confidence.
He has the cars, the money, the lifestyle.
But internally, John is battling a deep, hidden inadequacy.
His entire drive is based on a desperate, unacknowledged need for external validation.
Specifically, validation from the very cultural matrix he claims to despise.
Because he refuses to look at this needy, insecure shadow, it manifests in self-destructive behaviors, sabotaging his relationships and his peace of mind.
So, understanding that the shadow will destroy you if you ignore it, how do you actually integrate it?
The book doesn't just leave this as high-level psychological theory.
It offers highly practical, actionable strategies for this shadow work.
It suggests starting with shadow meditation.
This isn't about clearing your mind to find peace.
No, this is about sitting quietly in a dark room and intentionally allowing your most suppressed, ugliest, most aggressive thoughts to surface.
You observe them without judgment.
You acknowledge that you are capable of terrible things.
The author also strongly advocates for aggressive journaling to explore these darker aspects safely on paper, getting the poison out of the system.
Additionally, the Tickled recommends engaging in active imagination.
A specific Jungian technique where you literally dialogue with the unconscious parts of your mind.
Personifying your anger or your ambition and asking it what it wants and how it can serve you, rather than control you.
Now, as you do this deep internal dive, the book explains that you begin to tap into what Jung called the collective unconscious.
And this collective unconscious communicates with us not through language, but through symbols and archetypes.
The text discusses how ancient symbols like the Christian cross, the Eastern lotus, the intricate mandala, and the ancient serpent transcend all cultural and historical boundaries.
They are universally recognized by the human psyche.
The premise here is that for the red-pilled man navigating an incredibly confusing, deceptive modern world, these ancient symbols act as vital mental shortcuts.
They are compasses on the spiritual battlefield.
When the media is lying to you and the institutions are failing, these archetypes provide a grounded truth.
The author even references the French metaphysician René Guénon's exhaustive analysis of Dante's Divine Comedy.
The argument is that by deeply engaging with complex traditional symbolism like Dante's journey through hell to reach paradise, a modern man can bypass the noise of the culture,
expose deep spiritual understandings, and awaken a dormant part of his mind.
which transitions us perfectly into the final phase of this battle plan.
We've talked about the history of the enemy, the foundational psychology of survival, and doing the heavy internal lifting of integrating that dark shadow self.
But how does this translate to Tuesday morning when you step out your front door and commute to work?
How does a guy actually arm himself for this spiritual warfare day to day?
This brings us to section 4, the arsenal of the spiritual warrior.
And the very first weapon in this arsenal is another incredible, almost mystical Jungian concept: synchronicity.
Synchronicity is defined by Jung as the simultaneous occurrence of two meaningful but not causally connected events.
It is what the layman would call a meaningful coincidence.
But the text argues that there is no such thing as mere coincidence for the awakened mind.
A true spiritual warrior uses these synchronized events as literal divine nudges or directional guideposts from the universe.
But here's the catch. You have to actually be paying attention to notice them.
The author emphasizes that a distracted mind, a mind scrolling TikTok or absorbed in modern outrage porn, will miss these signals entirely.
The text references Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now to argue for extreme mindfulness and meditation.
The book equates mindfulness to upgrading your perception of reality from fuzzy, basic cable to stunning 4K high definition.
If you are ruthlessly fully present in the current moment, you start to perceive the matrix code.
You start to see these divine nudges aligning to guide your path.
And to make this actionable, the author offers a highly practical tip for the listener.
Start keeping a dedicated synchronicity journal.
Keep a small notebook in your pocket.
Whenever something happens that makes you pause, a chance encounter with an old friend who mentions exactly the book you needed to read, a recurring number pattern, an incredibly timely piece of advice overheard on the train, write it down immediately.
The text argues that over time, reviewing this journal will reveal undeniable patterns.
Providing profound, personalized insight into your spiritual direction.
I absolutely love that concept.
It turns everyday life into an active spiritual reconnaissance mission.
The next weapon in the arsenal is something much more visceral: balancing the physical and the spiritual.
The author is adamant that you cannot be a spiritual heavyweight if you are a physical lightweight.
A strong, healthy, capable body is the ultimate, non-negotiable weapon in spiritual warfare.
The text argues that the mind, body, and soul are inextricably linked.
Neglecting the physical body will inevitably degrade and weaken the soul.
To vividly illustrate this principle, the author points to the historical gold standard of martial masculinity.
The Spartans.
The text details how the Spartans engaged in the most rigorous, brutal physical training known to the ancient world, the agouge.
But this training wasn't just about building muscle to win battles.
It was holistically tied to instilling profound moral discipline, extreme endurance, and civic virtue.
The underlying philosophy was that voluntarily enduring intense physical trials directly leads to immense spiritual growth and fortitude.
The book also brings the receipts from modern science to back this up.
It cites specific statistical data from modern psychiatric journals,
noting that men who engage in intense, regular physical exercise reduce their risk of developing depression by an impressive 23%.
Pumping iron isn't just about vanity.
It is literal biochemical armor against the despair of the modern world.
You lift heavy things to make your mind heavy enough to withstand the cultural barrage.
The author even elevates the concept of rest, placing a massive emphasis on sleep.
In a hustle culture that often glorifies burnout, the text calls sleep tactical rejuvenation for forthcoming battles.
It frames rest as mental ammunition.
If you are chronically exhausted, sleep deprived, and fueled by energy drinks, your psychological defenses are lower.
You become highly vulnerable to the cultural conditioning, emotional manipulation, and spiritual attacks occurring all around you.
You have to treat your body not just as a temple, but as the primary weapons platform it is.
Finally, we reach the capstone of the battle plan.
Despite the book's earlier, heavy critiques of how modern organized religious institutions may have been infiltrated and softened by cultural Marxism.
The author strongly advocates for returning to deep, traditional religious disciplines.
He believes these ancient practices are the foundational bedrock of a man's spiritual arsenal.
The text goes into detail on the practice of fasting.
It cites the modern pastor Jefferson Franklin, echoing the ancient wisdom that fasting isn't just a diet or a denial of food.
It's a profound act of physical surrender.
The argument is that by intentionally denying the body's most basic urge, a man creates a literal physical and spiritual vacuum.
Creating space for God's power to enter and bringing intense, razor-sharp mental clarity.
The author also emphasizes the uncompromising study of the Bible.
In the context of spiritual warfare, he doesn't refer to the text as just a book of moral suggestions,
but as a literal sword and shield against satanic ideologies.
The premise is that immersing yourself in objective, ancient truth equips you with the discernment necessary to instantly spot and fend off modern cultural deception.
And of course, he mandates unyielding prayer and intentional gratitude to maintain the spiritual stamina required for lifelong fight.
But perhaps the most crucial strategy the author advocates for in this entire final section is community building.
You cannot survive a siege alone.
The text references the Benedict option by conservative author Rod Dreher.
Dreher's book discusses the absolute necessity of forming tight-knit, intentional, supportive alliances in an increasingly hostile post-Christian environment.
The author applies this directly to the manosphere, arguing that red-pilled men cannot fight this massive institutional battle as isolated lone wolves.
They will be picked off or driven mad.
They must actively build real-world communities, tribes of like-minded men to withstand the cultural Marxist onslaught.
They must operate on the ancient proverbial principle that iron sharpens iron.
Iron sharpens iron. It's the perfect encapsulation of the entire ethos.
It really is.
Okay, we have covered an incredible amount of ground today, traversing history, psychology, and theology. Let's summarize the overarching roadmap Conrad Riker lays out in spiritual warfare.
The journey starts with a painful awakening, taking the red pill, and acknowledging the stark reality of institutional capture by Marxist and feminist ideologies.
Once awake, the plan requires using the foundational psychological frameworks of Maslow and Erickson to fortify the mind.
Secure your physical baseline and resolve your lingering childhood crises.
From there, the roadmap demands the sheer psychological courage to look inward and embrace the dangerous masculine shadow through the grueling process of Jungian individuation.
And finally culminates in taking relentless outward action.
Utilizing the magic of synchronicity,
Optimizing physical health to Spartan levels.
and engaging in deep, ancient spiritual disciplines and tribal community building to actively fight back against cultural decay.
It is a dense, multi-layered...
Deeply inward to fix his own flaws while simultaneously remaining hyper-vigilant of the massive cultural forces operating outward.
It truly is. Now, as we wrap up this massive exploration, we want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over.
Something that builds on the roadmap we've discussed today, but wasn't explicitly stated in the text itself.
The book demands an uncompromising pursuit of absolute truth and a total rejection of mainstream narratives to achieve masculine self-actualization.
But if that is the case, how does the modern spiritual warrior ensure he is following genuine divine intuition and objective truth, rather than just trading one societal echo chamber for another?
When you join a new tribe, how do you know your newly found red-pilled community isn't just another matrix with a different coat of paint?
That is a profound, slightly terrifying question. It demands constant, rigorous, unsparing self-reflection, to ensure that your pursuit of truth doesn't just evolve into another form of lazy ideological conformity.
Keep questioning everything, guys.
Especially your own shadows. Thank you so much for joining us on this intense deep dive. Please, if you haven't already, take a second to hit those like and subscribe buttons right now to support the show.
As a reminder, today we comprehensively reviewed Conrad Reicher's ebook, Spiritual Warfare: Masculine Enlightenment in a Broken World.
It is an absolute must-read if you are intrigued by the psychological and cultural concepts we unpacked today.
Do yourself a favor, head over to Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book right now.
And finally, to continue this exact type of conversation, make sure you follow the author at Conrad Reicher at Substack. Until next time, stay sharp and stay curious.